Friday the 13th Part 3 was the series' first and only attempt at achieving 3D. In theaters, it was known as Friday the 13th Part 3D, although until recently the home video versions never carried over the 3D effect. At the time, Part 3 marked a technical landmark for Paramount Pictures, because not a lot of movies at the time were being produced that way. They had to develop a production system called AirVision, which entailed manufacturing special projection lenses that would allow the effect to flourish in theaters. In layman's terms, it wasn't the gimmicky blue and red 3D that preceded it, and was supposed to look impressive on the big screen.
You didn't have that red-blue, it wasn't the red-blue 3D, it was this new process so the glasses were clear and polarized.
Allegedly, the cheap blue and red effect was used to emulate the effect for the most recent DVD and Blu-ray releases, and it failed miserably, according to the fans. I never saw the movie in 3D, although it's not hard to figure out exactly what shots were meant for the effect. Like in a lot of 3D to 2D conversions today, it's easy to point out what shots were designed in 3D because of what comes in and comes out of the frame. For starters, the movie's opening title sequence uses 3D text, in which the actual titles come flying off the screen. There's a snake, a baseball bat, someone's detached eyeball. It all sounds pretty impressive, but without the 3D effect, a lot of the gore in this one is left to the imagination, and the overall effect is a little hokey, making it the most disappointing entry out of the first 3 films. The movie takes place just one day after Part 2, and begins just down the street at a couple's shop. We see Jason, unmasked, lurking in the shadows, which is pretty creepy. If anything, they at least create the proper mood for a Friday the 13th film. Without giving away the details, the couple doesn't make it very far, and we then shift over to our main set of characters. The protagonist is Chris, who is taking her friends out to her family farm for a summer getaway. The film actually doesn't take place at Crystal Lake, but at the farm, although if you weren't paying attention to the story, you wouldn't know the difference. Chris is accompanied by Debbie and Andy, a couple with a baby on the way, Vera Sanchez, a Puerto Rican with parent problems, Chuck and Chili, the token stoners of the group, and Shelley, the overweight outcast who comes with a bag filled with inappropriate practical jokes.
God damn it, Shelley, why do you always have to be such an asshole?
I beg your pardon, I'm not an asshole. I'm an actor.
Same thing.
They said they were going skinny dipping, and I'm not skinny enough. Would you be yourself if you look like this?
For some reason, fans always gravitate to Shelley, probably because his character is actually identifiable. There's also Rick, Chris's old flame, who hopes to rekindle a long-lost romance. So as you can see, they at least try to come up with some interesting characters. Where the film falls flat is that everything feels so routine. The characters seem to all act stupider, and again the gore was sacrificed for the elaborate 3D that we never got to see at home. At one point there's an interesting scene where Shelley and Vera, his blind date, encounter a group of motorcycle thugs. Things don't go too well, and the motorcyclists track Shelley back to the farm, where they end up falling prey to Jason's onslaught. Let's talk about Jason for a moment. In the first movie, we're not even sure if Jason is a real entity, and he only appears as an 11-year-old mongoloid boy. In Part 2, Jason becomes the central killer. He's fully grown, although we assume he's hideously deformed because he always wears that ridiculous potato sack over his head. Because of this, Jason was appropriately made to stumble around. In Part 3, Jason is played by Richard Brooker, and honestly, there's not much change to his performance. At this point, Jason was thought of as a flesh-and-blood killer. He's fully grown, and presumably he spent the last 20 years surviving in the wilderness. At the end of Part 2, the heroine Ginny Field impales Jason through the shoulder with a machete, although at the beginning of Part 3 he's shown slowly crawling away, off to kill more stupid kids. The filmmakers don't ignore this injury because Jason is clearly seen slumping around the film as if he's been injured. This is fine, but my complaint comes with his overall design. Like in Part 2, we actually see him unmasked, and he looks nothing like he did before. The most obvious difference is his loss of hair. He obviously has strands of hair when we see him jump through a window in Part 2, and yet now he's completely bald. The movie only takes place 24 hours afterwards, so there's no way he could have miraculously cut off his hair, unless he went to seek out the Crystal Lake barber. And who would be insane enough to cut his hair, Sweeney Todd? Joking aside, we learn that Chris actually had an encounter with Jason a few summers prior, and the real reason she came back to her family's farm was to confront her fears. This is interesting and adds an element of suspense to the film, but in her flashbacks, Jason looks the same. Without hair! Understandably, each Friday the 13th movie has a different set of designers for Jason's look, but I never understood why there was such a lack of consistency between films. A lot of people know this film as the one that gave Jason his infamous hockey mask. Originally, the mask starts off as one of Shelley's pranks. Without spoiling anything, Jason manages to take the mask and adapt it for himself. What a lot of people might not know was that the mask was a mistake, and was used simply for a lighting test so they could light the actor accordingly. The crew liked the mask so much that they designed one that was more appropriate for the character and went with it. And by the way, the original mask they used was a Red Wings goaltender mask. With the past two films, the climax was generally the best part of the movie. With this one, there are definitely some suspenseful scenes, but then they go ahead and ruin it when Chris hacks Jason in the head with an axe, and he keeps coming toward her like the Frankenstein monster. What I will say about this, however, is that for whatever reason, the filmmakers carried over this injury into pretty much every sequel that followed. That's all good, but if they can make his mask look the same, why the hell can't they make his face look consistent? Maybe it's because the point is Jason's mask is his real face, but that's a little too philosophical for a Friday the 13th film. All in all, it's really not a bad movie, and it's not the absolute worst in the series' history, but it was a film that focused on the 3D technology more than on the movie itself, and obviously we can't witness its splendor on the home front. I'm sure someday when 3D TVs become more mainstream, we'll get a chance to see it in real 3D, the way it was intended. But for some reason, I don't think they had this movie in mind when they invented 3D televisions. Would anyone like an extra helping of Avatar? Its main fault, though, is that it gets sandwiched between Part 2 and Part 4, the final chapter, which is arguably one of the best films in the franchise, so on a typical level, it's pretty forgettable. Still, find a comfy couch, a few friends, or a date to sling your arm over, and you're in for a pretty fun slasher film.
Yes, he wanted me to warn you. Look upon this omen, and go back from whence ye came. I have warned thee. Aye.